Welcome back to Climate Solutions News. I'm Dominic Shales, and today we're exploring a topic really at the cutting edge of climate solutions, artificial intelligence, AI. And specifically a new report published this week in the Nature journal NPJ Climate Action, which sets out how the application of AI in just three sectors, power, transport and food consumption, could reduce global emissions of greenhouse gases by 3.2 to 5.4 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent annually by 2035. Now, given that the current estimate of emissions is between 54 to 57 billion tonnes per year, that's a substantial proportion. The authors of the report say that if AI is effectively applied in key impact areas, the estimated emissions reductions would outweigh increases from global power consumption of data centers and AI. So that's obviously a criticism that we can come on to look at specifically. Now, the report's called Green and Intelligent, the Role of AI in the Climate Transition, and it's produced by the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and Systemiq. And I'm delighted that we're joined by one of the writers of the report, Dr Mattia Romani. Hello, Mattia, and thank you for joining us today.
A pleasure to be here.
Mattia is a partner and head of sustainable finance at Systemiq and senior visiting fellow at the Grantham Research Institute. And he's worked in private investment and sustainability and served as managing director for economics, policy and governance at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He was formerly deputy director general of the Global Green Growth Institute in South Korea. He worked with Professor Nicholas Stern on the Stern Review and was a senior expert in sustainability and resource productivity at McKinsey. He started his career at Shell working in the scenarios team and holds a DPhil in economics from Oxford and an MSc in development studies from the LSE. Storied career, and we're delighted to have you here. To kick things off, Mattia, I mean, distinguished as you are, obviously personally from that introduction, it's probably worth mentioning your co-writers too, as it's a very impressive group of people. Who else worked with you on this report?
So thank you, Dominic, and thanks for the introduction. It makes me feel old primarily. This particular work was really a joint work between the London School of Economics and Systemiq. The idea came really to me and Nick Stern as this is a year and a half ago. We were asked to write something for the World Economic Forum on this topic. And we started doing the math, and it became clear to us that AI has certain characteristics that make it very well suited to accelerate the take-up of low-carbon technologies. And we asked ourselves, well, what if AI was used to do that as opposed to, selling you the next T-shirt on Instagram or creating a picture of a cute cat? What if we were able to use AI to accelerate the tipping points of key low-carbon technologies? Because if you think about it, and that's somehow what's in the paper, if you think about it, what AI does, it really optimizes complex systems. It helps you discover new materials. It helps nudge behaviors, as we know very well. It improves modeling. And these are all things which are at the core of the low-carbon transition. So we just thought, let's do the maths and let's try to figure out how big that contribution could be and how it compares to the additional emissions of powering AI.
And you dive into kind of 5 key impact areas for AI, as well as 3 different sectors, as I mentioned. Do you want to take us through those 5 key areas and how they all rank in terms of relative importance of potential impact?
Absolutely. These are really 5 levers, if you want, that we think AI could be particularly powerful in the context of the low carbon transition. First of all, optimization of complex systems. Think about, at the simplest form, your Google Maps and its ability to reroute a taxi driver through the lower emission routes on the road. Or think about optimization of demand and supply in power systems. They're all based on prediction, on predicting which is the route that will encounter the least traffic, or when is the moment in which demand and supply can be met in an optimal manner in a power system. Well, AI is great at that. It does the kind of prediction much, much better than model-based prediction can be done. And that's the first one where we think there's substantial potential. The second one is discovery and innovation of materials. And this has become very, very evident in the battery space, where facing a shortage of critical minerals to make batteries, AI helped us discover much faster than it could have ever done before alternative materials that have the kind of characteristics we need to make batteries. So this discovery innovation plays in that field, but plays in other fields, like, for example, alternative proteins and the kind of chemical substances that optimize certain characteristics that are required for alternative proteins.
Yeah,
The
we'll come
third
back to
area,
that because I think that's a fascinating topic.
I agree. The third area is nudging behaviors. And this we know very well because we interact with our phones all the time, and our phones are very good at predicting what we might want to consume. Now, think about using that power to nudge people towards consuming lower carbon goods or choosing a lower carbon transport mode. And the power of that is enormous, and it's becoming better and better. The fourth area that we identify, the fourth lever, is about modeling. And here, the example I like to use is the fact that last year, for the first time, AI became better than model-based, quantitative model-based weather predictions. So weather predictions now are more powerfully done by AI systems than they are by traditional predictive models. Modeling has been transformed by this. And yes, in climate science and in weather predictions, but also, for example, in societal response to public policy. So you set some incentives by public policy. You want to check how people are going to change their behaviors. According to that, AI is brilliant at predicting that. And then last but not least, the fifth lever we identify is about adaptation and resilience. And this is all about how to better be prepared to unexpected changes in weather patterns or extreme weather events. And that, again, is down to predictions. And again, AI is phenomenally good at this predictions.
And in this last one, managing resilience and adaptation, is there actually a carbon saving from that, or is it more about just coping with the effects?
This is primarily about coping with the effects of climate. But as we know, adaptation investments and resilience investments often have substantial co-benefits, particularly when they involve nature-based services. And again, AI can help estimate and maximize those co-benefits. For example, we did a project at Systemiq in which we looked in depth about the potential of mangroves to help both with adaptation and resilience on coastal areas, but also in that case with emission reductions. And AI can really help predict how different sort of formats and location of mangroves can help both maximizing resilience, but also maximizing emission reduction. So that's the kind of use that we have in mind.
Okay, so those five, so it's transforming complex systems, innovating sort of technology discovery and novel developments, nudging and behavioral change, modeling the systems, and then managing the resilience and adaptations. And is that the ranking of impact as well in that order, or which is the most important, do you think?
That depends very much on what sector you're looking at. As you were saying earlier, all we did in this paper, instead of trying to figure out how these 5 levels work, if you want, at a macro level, and trying to push those levers and see what happens to a macro model, which is what economists normally do, i.e. they try to look at the full system, adapt these levers, and see what is the impact on growth and emissions and so on. We did it differently. We did it bottom up. So we just picked 3 sectors. We picked energy, mobility, and the food space. And within these 3 sectors, we just looked at 3 specific technologies. In the case of energy, is the adoption of solar and wind. In the case of mobility, is the adoption of electric vehicles. In the case of nature and food, is the adoption of alternative proteins. And we just looked at how those different levels could play out in the specific sectors. And in some sectors, like energy, for example, the optimization of complex system is by far the biggest lever. In others, like nature and food, the discovery of innovation in materials and the nudging can be a lot more powerful than the optimization. So it depends a little bit on the sectors.
I'd like to dive into the alternative proteins because I think, what you say in the report is that one of the uses of AI could be to actually make alternative proteins taste better and become more appealing, and therefore, drive the uptake, and that's related to nudging. Is that a realistic scenario? Are people not just put off fundamentally by alternative proteins or lab-grown meats or whatever it might be? Do you think it's actually a realistic proposal that could have a material impact?
Yeah. So, of course, these are not easy questions. These are just predictions and scenario based on behaviors which we calculated on the back of how we saw similar technologies being adopted in the past. But with food, of course, this is not an easy one. The first thing to remember is that when it comes to alternative proteins, we're not talking about replacing the steak that you may have once a month or that nice piece of roasted chicken that you have on a Sunday. A lot of the meat we consume goes into processed food. This would be the meat that goes into a pizza, for example, or the meat that goes into a ready-made sauce, or the meat that goes into a fast food burger. And in those cases, it's much easier to replace meat with an alternative protein base because, in a way, it's easier to reach that taste and texture required for that food to become appealing. And another good example is that a lot of the meat today goes into pet food. And we know we can replace that with alternative proteins without changing, in fact, improving the quality of that food for our pets. So there's different ways in which you can build that sort of alternative proteins without ruining your Sunday roast.
Yeah. So power, meat and dairy and light transport are the ones that you looked at, and they account for roughly 50% of emissions. Did you, as a matter of interest, not kind of specifically exclude like industrial processes or heavy transport for any particular reason, or were the data sets easier for these particular three areas?
The choice of these three areas was driven by two factors. One is that they are the largest emitters, and so it was we wanted to catch, if you want, the largest first. And second, because the data and the kind of technological change that happens in the sectors was easier for us to model because we had more information about it and more information about previous events of technological changes in the sectors that would give us some comfort that we could use S-curves. This is all based on S-curves of adoption of technology that gave us more comfort that we could predict those with some element of empirical evidence. And as you indicated at the beginning, this led us to a range of results because we have some uncertainties around, of course, those adoption rates. But that's the reason why. One important thing, Dominic, that I want to emphasize is that there's one element of the way in which we approach this issue that should make you optimistic about the fact that our results are very conservative, and another elements that should make you cautious in these results. And it's important people understand that when they read this paper. The element that should make you optimistic is that we looked at it by design in a very static manner. We just look at how this particular sectors will look like. But we know that there'll be significant spillover effects from the innovation of one sector to the other. And we know that the other sectors would benefit from the spillover effects. And there's plenty of evidence that when you have technological advance in a particular sector, other sectors will benefit. And so we assume that there'll be some spillover effects that will imply that other sectors will reduce their emissions, but we don't account for those. We just account for these three specific sectors in a static manner. And the reason for it is that we want to be conservative. We want to say, well, what is the minimum that we can expect AI to contribute? But the area that should make you cautious is that in this paper we don't look at the potential for second round of increased demand once these technologies deliver better results and cheaper solutions. Will people consume more? And therefore there'll be what economists call some rebound effect that will increase overall demand and increase. And this is something that we ought to take into account. But again, this comes from the dynamic study. And for this point, and this is the beginning, I hope, of research that will continue, we wanted to focus on trying to give a static result that would give an idea of the scale of potential.
Could you give us some sort of sense of the balancing equation between how you modeled the potential carbon savings versus the increased use of AI to achieve those savings? What's the kind of quantum of increase in carbon emissions that you see? How does that balance out?
Yeah, so I'll tell you the story of that because it was very timely. So we started writing this article, came out just this week, but we started writing this article last year. And at the time, the estimates of the increasing use of AI was still rudimentary. But we did a secondary analysis, as we took other people's work to figure out roughly what kind of increase in power demand would be associated with the increase of all AI, not just AI for the sectors we're talking about. We wanted to see what all AI would consume in terms of power and its emissions. And again, we were very conservative, so we assumed that technology would not improve in AI data centers, and so that the consumption of power would be based on what we know AI consumes today. And you could say that's conservative because AI and the technology associated with the energy consumption of AI is improving every day. We also took an assumptions that AI would use grid power, and so the average emissions associated with the power of the grid. And we know that today many hyperscalers actually are using power which is more based on renewables than the average grid. But nonetheless, we took the average grid, assuming that in the future, with a lot of demand of AI, that may not be possible. And then we calculated roughly, given the amount of AI demand that we found from the secondary sources, what the additional emissions of the AI would come to. And we concluded that on average, this would be between 1 and 2 gigatons of emissions by 2035. And remember, this compares to the 3.5 to 5.5, roughly, say, call it 4.5 emission reductions that AI could generate. So we concluded that still the net impact of AI could be positive and potentially very positive indeed. Some of the dynamic effects play out. But interestingly, the IEA came out in February with I would say, the first most authoritative analysis on the emissions associated with AI. And you may have covered it in this program because it was a very important report. And this report concluded that by 2035, emissions from all AI would be around 1 gigatons, which is within our range. So somehow we came to a number that gave us some comfort that we were about right and confirmed our thesis that the potential for AI for emission reductions remains substantial.
I think one of the powers of AI is that it can provide sort of incremental small gains across a huge number of different areas. And, you talk in the report about accelerating tipping points. So, AI is obviously not one solution. It's multiple solutions across all sorts of different areas, all sorts of different industries, all sorts of different applications. So it's that cumulative effort, isn't it, that can really be brought to bear on tackling the issue.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And so we based this tipping points observation on another piece of work we produced with Systemiq a couple of years ago called Breakthrough Effect, which I would really recommend you cover in the program because it's a tremendous report that basically says that over the next decade, technologies that could allow us to reduce emissions by 40% across the economy are becoming competitive. They're becoming cheaper and better than incumbent technologies. So we could really, over the next decade, simply because of economics, forget about policy, forget about carbon pricing, forget about mandatory limits, just simply because of economics, we could in the next decade see half of the emissions of the world simply being reduced by the adoption of these technologies. What we're saying is that AI incrementally, sector by sector, is going to nudge this innovation to make it happen faster and faster so we can get access to cheaper and better technologies faster. Cheaper, better, and faster. You may say, is this all hunky-dory? Are we done? The climate crisis is averted? Absolutely not. And in the paper, we make it clear that all of this is conditional to using AI in a much more intentional manner around climate action. And at the moment, we're simply not there. Tech companies, governments, and energy companies need to come together and understand how this more intentional application can be generated, and not in a top-down manner, but really incentivized for everybody to use it to do that nudging and the incremental changes across the different sectors.
And who is responsible for those incentives? I think, are we now at a position where it's government that needs to take the lead? Have businesses got to step up even more? Is it consumers who need to be making active choices? What's the ranking order of who needs to take responsibility for driving the change?
I wish I could tell you that it's a simple answer and one of these actors should do it, but it's not as easy as that. It's really down to co-creations and creating unusual new coalitions. It's about leadership, and that leadership ought to come from governments and private sector together. We saw them coming together in Paris on AI. There were some advancements. We saw them coming together on AI and security in the UK about 2 years ago. We need now world leaders, tech leaders, energy leaders to come up and say that there's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to use AI to help us in the climate crisis we're going through. And we haven't seen that leadership come up. And frankly, part of the reason why we wrote this paper is to facilitate that leadership, a call for action for leadership in this space.
Good. Well, you've clearly conveyed an optimism that the solutions are there. I think that's a challenge to finish things off. That people need to keep stepping up and need to keep taking the logical actions and putting in place the steps that can get us there. I'd like to thank you very much, Mattia Romani, who is author of this fascinating paper from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at LSE and Systemiq. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Dominic.